Tau mai te mauri anuku, tau mai te mauri rangi, tau mai te mauri whakapati ki te ki te marama. Tu turuka whakamau kia tīna, hui e, tā iki e. Nō rea kua hui tēnei, ne ki tōko tau kai whakahaere mo tēnei wahanga ko Kiwi Hammond, no Aotearoa, ētahi o ngā kai tautoko o te kaupapa nei. Nō rea ka mihi tonu ki a koutou, Jess, paunamu koutou nā, no koutou te whakaaro kia tū te Wānanga a tui hono nei. Koe no ko te wahanga ki au, he facilitate i tā tātou hui. Nō reira tuatahi atu, me tuku mihi ka tika, me tuku mihi ki ngā māngai ki ngā kai kōrero, ko whakai mai, kia uru mai ki roto i tēnei kaupapa kōrero. E pāra ki ngā transition, ka waiho mā koutou, hei kōrero ki tawa kaupapa. Nō rea ka tīmata mai ai te maunga tito hea, Taranaki, te tai hauauru, ia te tawa tipua o Whanganui. Nō rea e te tuahine, Hinekaa, kōrua tahi ko Mike, kai te patu tonu i te huarahi huri no i te motu, kawe ai te kupu ki ngā tōpito o te motu nei, o tira ki tu atu hoki, nō rea kai te mihi atu ki a koe o tira kōrua tahi, i rongo mātou ia koe tohu ani ia mai ki tata nei, mai te taha, aha koe i te kare ki te tokanohi, i rongo hau i tō reo. O reira, tēnā koe te tuahine. Hoi no, ka whakapitatu ki tainui waka, ki tō tāwarahi o Ngāti Maniapoto e Mike, nō reira, kai te mihi atu ki a koe hoa, ka hoki ngā maumahara ki ngā kaupapa mahi roto pōne ki ngā tau o mua, o rea he rau e te kitati a koe, o rea tēnā koe. Whakamutu atu ki taku karangatanga ki a Raihānia. Ka rea hoi mihi ki a Raihānia, mena ka mihi hau ki aia, kai te mihi hau ki hau anō. Ko tōna whakapapa, ko tōku whakapapa. Hoi anō, i rote ngā kaupapa, kua whaia e taku karangatanga a Raihānia, ai ngā tau, ka mihi ki wera kaupapa, me tōna kaha ki te kawi wera kaupapa. So, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for being part of this workshop. I'd like to just briefly, introduce our speakers if you didn't work it out already. We have the amazing, well-traveled Hinekaa Mako, who hails from Taranaki and Whananga tata ki tako Wārangatira ki a Hinerangi. Also, good to see you, Mike, and to hear more about the kaupapa that you've been involved in more recent times. And as I was saying before, when it comes to Raihānia Tipoki, I can't do a mihi to him because if I do that, I'm doing a mihi to myself. Because we come from the same whakapapa, from the same DNA pool and so on. But I would like to acknowledge all the kaupapa that Raihānia and many of you that have been involved in similar kaupapa have been doing. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to just explain. Each of our speakers has 5 to 10 minutes to talk to the kaupapa, and we're sticking the time, 18, sticking the time. And you should have co-hosting ability to be able to share any slides and things that you like to do. But I'll give you a little bit of a tohu, or send you a little bit of messages to say, hey, 5 minutes, 2 minutes, that sort of thing. Okay? And then hopefully we'll have enough time at the end for a question and answer. So, ia ki ngā kōranga mātua tipuna, aku kuia, I puta mai koe i a hau, I te wahine, nō re me timata mai ngā kōrero i a koe Hinekaa, nō re mā hau e arataki ngā kōrero tēnei wā. So I'd like to just present to you Hinekaa Mako, and just a reminder about our kōrero, what our kaupapa is. It's the transitions. To highlight the need for transitions to more sustainable and regenerative ways of producing food and caring for soil. And this session focuses on the alignment between regenerative agriculture and Māori kai and soil resiliency, raising awareness of the benefits of transitional agricultural approaches to Māori in the agricultural sector. Koe no ka waiho manga kai kōrero, e kōrero ki te kaupapa nei, o rei kei a koe Hinekaa, tēnā tātou.
Tēnā koe, taku tingane kiwa, koe tu katoa Aotearoa, ngā kai wakarite katoa, papakarito, Jess, te pune koe, nehi kauatu ana ki ngā kōrero kua ranguna hinana I tēnei ata hoki. Tēnā miharo te ranguna te mahana I roto I tēnei Krieg, te aroa nui ki kei waingi I a tātou, e miharo. So, thank you very much for the warm welcome and the warm wānanga that we've been participating in. I was anticipating being last, so I do want to acknowledge that I haven't been able to touch base with Mike and Raihānia, but I have a huge amount of respect for all the work on the ground and in their communications. I've often heard both speak, whether that's at a conference, at home, in their own environments. I really respect and have a huge amount of aroha for these two tāne. And so I am hoping that all that I am not able to contribute to this Wānanga in the terms of the on-the-ground mahi mara, that's not my area of expertise, and also having listened to so much yesterday, I last night scrambled to do a bit of a slide deck because I very, I don't know, grandiosely maybe announced, I won't need a slide deck, I'll just have a kōrero about our kaupapa. But I decided I wanted to contribute some things, having been inspired by what Jess mentioned about reconnecting with our visual. My apologies if my sound goes in and out because we're sharing bandwidth and the Northa, Mike's in another Hubert. I just paused myself, I think, when this message pops up about the sound, and my apologies for that. But let's get into this mahi. I'll share the beautiful artwork of Koka Kahutua to start my kōrero. Can you all see that? I press play. Can you see my notes? I read that. Yeah. So maybe I'll start again. So let's get this right. You might notice I am not an expert at this. Sent it to Rahiri Makuini. Now, someone help me.
Yep. So Hine, it's Hinerangi here. Can you send it to me? Okay. But you keep talking and I'll flick you my email address.
Alrighty. I would have thought there was just a simple play, but
you just preempted me.
Okay, are you sending it in a text?
In the chat to Hine.
Aroha mai koutou, but I want to maybe just start my kōrero and say, if you're all aware of the beautiful whakahua from Kahukiwa Whapatuanuku.
Who do you want to send it to?
Sorry, I'm having tech issues. Where she has a visualization anyway of tamanui te rā, and it's radiating warmth and light and energy and te Whānui o tāne, te moana and te mato te whenua. And so we have Whapatu visualized beautifully these tokotoko rangi, and they are basically representations of the spectrum of atua that support our existence. So that, as I just very quickly get this email from Hinerangi, which I can't seem to find. There we go. And I will get that image up for you all shortly. Oh, Hinerangi as well. A quick way to do this. Can I perhaps, Kiwa, is it all right if I go kei te mutunga o tēnei wahanga?
Kei te pai, Hineka. I think if I can go to Mike, aroha mai whānau. Mike, kei te pai, if he can jump in here, be super sub for now, and we'll sort out the stuff for Hineka. Kia ora.
Kia ora koutou katoa. Tēnā koutou e ngā rangatira mā. E te rangatira kiwa, tēnā koe. Kia ora koutou, ko mai Taitoko takuinga no Maniapoto ahau. And e te tuai ni Hinekaa, you just take your time, sister. We got an important kaupapa, a message to get across. So happy to jump in now. And just want to acknowledge big mihi to Jessica. Jess, this kaupapa, I believe personally, is the most important kaupapa of our time. And I could talk for a month on why I think that's the case, but I'll give a glimpse of that in the corridor now, and want to acknowledge Hinekaa and Raihānia. Raihānia is doing it on the ground in real time and in real life, and my respect for the mahi and the way you're doing it and the grace in which this mahi has been carried out is so important, and to have leaders and leadership that we can turn to and point to and say, let's go and check out how these fellows are doing it, because it's important we get our heads around this stuff, and it's important, I believe, we do it quickly. Hinerangi, awesome to see you and your kōtero, rahiri tēnā koe, and great to see the Aotearoa whānau driving this kaupapa again. This is important. So, real quick background, I spent probably best part of 15 years working in the Māori economic development space, which got us with iwi and Māori organisations, government policy, industry crossover, working on strategy and policy and commercial stuff, which are inherently from a Māori perspective, as you all know, gets us into health and education and a whole bunch of other things. And over that time, I got probably the biggest lesson was the real life kind of observation of the breakdown between policy and getting things done on the ground, what works and what doesn't work. Big questions like, hang on, how is it that we've got these amazing projects on the ground but unfunded or underfunded, and projects that aren't working continue to succeed in getting the big funding and contracting models up? And that applies all the way through when we look at the industrial system as well. So on top of colonisation, we've seen this industrialisation model play out, and for us as Māori, for a lot of us, we embraced that like there was no tomorrow. And so high intensive farming was something that we were led to believe, and we did believe was the way to go for a lot of our whenua. And as everyone here knows, a lot of our whenua that we managed to retain, which is now mostly Māori freehold land, was also supposedly unproductive, and so hence why we kept it. So I went on a journey about 3 years ago looking at the climate that Mike spoke about earlier this morning, and mihi to Mike as well. I know Hinekaa and Mike, the work they do traveling around the motu is really is super important, and so big mihi to you both for carrying on that mahi. We looked at the climate crisis and looked at food systems and biodiversity loss, and three of us founded a company called Toha to build an impact investment platform where we could disregard the breakdowns in government funding and contracting to get to those projects that work. And so if we can prove that some of this mahi is actually making a difference for whānau communities, then we should be able to attract funding that can get to those projects and make them sustainable and enduring, until such time we can carry on and do it ourselves without outside help. In that first bit of research, we looked at what's the areas we think we can potentially make the biggest impact on, and we looked across biodiversity, we looked across sea rise, we looked across a whole bunch of things, oceans, and the first place we decided to look at was regenerative agriculture. And the reason we decided to look at regenerative agriculture was because in our Aotearoa context, as you know, our biggest crisis around fresh water is driven by agricultural practices, predominantly dairy. And Mike showed us where those high intensive regions are, Waikato, Taranaki and Canterbury. And when we're diving deep into that, we were finding farmers out there in those regions who had managed to successfully back off all the chemicals, back off all the synthetic nitrogen, reduce stock numbers, and become more profitable as a consequence. And so the ways they were starting to do that, we were diving into it, was, really started to think about, rather than focusing on farming, was start to focus on soil health. So rather than farming animals, start to think about how we grow the kind of the natural biological function of the soil. And so here we had mostly Pākehā farmers talking to us about having to look after and protect whenua, the soil health, in order to grow better pastures, in order to grow healthier animals, in order to provide better sustenance and healthier food for our whānau. That was 3 years ago. Jump to yesterday, we had some farmers. I'm in the Tairāwhiti office with my team at the moment. Some farmers came into the office yesterday, Pākehā farmers, sheep and beef, trying to stop the collapse of the sheep and beef industry in our communities here, and losing those farms to carbon farmers who are going to put pine trees in and never harvest them, because they're making their money overseas off our Whenua through the trees we're growing that are never going to be harvested. So the production loss in the region is massive. The community collapse potentially is massive, and we're not putting enough effort into solving it. So that's the big picture, that when we drill down, we really get interested in saying, well, we've got all this Māori freehold land across the country that we've been led to believe is productive. Well, actually, there's some awesome examples, and Jessica, the work, the research and mahi you guys do, we know this, is that if we focus on the soil health and the biology and get the chemicals out and do this in a way that is kind of smart, working with nature, working with our whānau communities, getting our hands in that soil, that not just the healing process we can go through, but the production that we can get off and the yields, to put it in an economic sense, that we can get off our Whenua, our Māori freehold land, it's insane. And so then you look at, our dairy farming, for example, and a lot of it on Māori freehold land. With Pākehā farmers, we're seeing them destock by 10 to 20%. We're seeing them put diverse plant species in. They're getting deeper root zone. They're holding the water and the moisture in the soil. They're getting through the droughts. Okay. With our Māori freehold land, we know we've got a big opportunity. But to Jessica's question earlier this morning around mindset, 100% we've got a mindset shift we need to make. We might have kaitiaki kanga written all through our annual reports for our farming reports, but it's hard to see in a lot of cases, not all, in a lot of cases, how that's actually been practiced. And so I kind of jumped around all over the place from big macro challenges down to why I think this kaupapa is important, but I'll finish it there just by saying that imagine if we could get our whānau on that Māori freehold land to support them to find ways to think about, and I don't want to say industrialized, but how do we deindustrialize ourselves and make the most of what we have right in front of us right now, just on our Māori freehold land, we could feed this entire nation. There is zero doubt about that. But as long as we continue to have an industrialized mindset in the way we grow our kai, we won't even be able to feed ourselves. So, and again, that's a few layers. We could go all day about that, but happy to take Pātai further on, but hand it over, Hinekaa or Raihānia, kia ora.
Kia ora, Mike. Some real key things coming out of there is utilisation of freehold Māori land and being able to feed the country, feed the nation, and more. Whenua. I'll pass it over to Raihānia now. And being a close whanaunga of mine, I know that coming from a very strong farming background through his parents and down there in Wairarapa. So I can see my cousin's a little bit distracted by something at the moment, but I'll give him a moment just to tee himself up to have a kōrero to us about what they're doing. Kia ora. E te pai?
Was that me, cuz? Okay, kia ora tātou. Some fire issues, so hopefully I'll stay in there. Nā mihi nui ki a koutou katoa, koutou ngā kai whakahaere o tēnei kaupapa, nā mihi nui e te whanaunga, e ngā whanaunga. Yeah, I just want to, I guess, bounce off Mike's kōrero a bit. I love that point there, Mike, about getting our whānau Māori reconnected with the land, back onto the land. I think that's the hugest challenge for us. And if you look back in history, it's pretty clear how the government was able to disconnect us. And it was such an important part of colonization, is to disconnect the people from the land so the land could be taken. That's the conversation that I'd be, that I'd love to be engaged in more often. In terms of I guess I better start with my journey. You know, I don't want to take up too much time. I was really hoping to go last, Hinekaa, because I really wanted to listen to what you had to say, and Mike, of course, too. But nevertheless, I'll see how we go. Now, why can't I share slideshow? Get out of my way. Here we go. Okay. Oops. So this photo here is of our Mounga whakapunake back in at Taranaki and Wairoa. It's taken from our station, the top of our Mounga on one of our farms, Mahurangi Station. I put this here just to show where I'm from, where Kiwa and I are from, and just to make a point that back in my father's day, Kiwa's mum and my dad were both brought up on their whenua, as were most of our extended whānau as well. Brought up on the whenua, basically living in a pā, sharing resources and living from the land. My mum was actually in a similar position. My mum's Pākehā from a little
recording in progress.
Taranaki. And they didn't have a car. They shared a car with two other families. And yeah, it was really basic living. They lived off the land. My grandfather, he didn't get a loan like most of the returned soldiers from World War II. He had to get a loan from was basically the National Bank. But yeah, they all lived off the land back in those days, and it wasn't. Yeah, it was, you make everything, you preserved everything. There was a real relationship with the land. I remember Mum telling me back then, but whatever it was prior to being the National Bank came to my grandfather and basically encouraged him to use super phosphate, and that's what they did. They sent around these people around to their farms and convincing them to use super phosphate. I think that must have been back in the 50s, the mid 20th century. However, my next slide is not working. So this is where I am now. So my father moved down to the Wairarapa. This is a flyover of our farm. It's only a small farm, but we've been here since 78, just a little bit before I was born. My mum and dad farmed this piece of land here and another adjoining farm across the river. It wasn't regenerative in those days, but they haven't used super on here for a long time. It's pretty conventional the way my father was running it. But when I moved home, a bit about myself, I went to university to do environmental studies, ecology, and did a whole lot of education stuff, sailed a lot around the Pacific, and moved home in 2015 to support my dad on the farm. I'd always been interested in organics and permaculture, biodynamics and things like that, but I hadn't had the opportunity to practice it. And what I love about regenerative agriculture is that, like Mike said, it focuses on the soil. Basically hine ahuone, papatuanuku. And yeah, the three parts I see about regenerative pastoral farming is focusing on the soil, so the microorganisms within the soil, diversity of pastures, so more different species in your sward and your pasture, and then the grazing management of those pastures, which means mobbing up all your stock into small into big mobs and lengthening out the rotation. So when you take your cattle out of one paddock, they're not going to go back into that paddock for another 3 weeks or 3 or 4 weeks, which gives the time for that pasture to really grow. So what you see in a pasture is reflected in the soil. So if you've got a really healthy, diverse pasture, you'll have a really healthy, diverse soil but below. Yeah, like Mike said, we can talk for a long time about all the positives of regenerative agriculture, and I think when you look at all the dairy farm, we hate a lot of us really hate dairy farms and dairy farming, but there's a real opportunity there to transition dairy farmers into regenerative agriculture, because they've already sussed out the grazing management part of regen. Now, then all they need to do is obviously take away the chemical inputs, and then if they haven't already, get more diverse species in their pasture, and then they've kind of sorted out the grazing management part of it. So there's huge potential there across the country. But like Mike kind of said, there's all these positives with regen, but we're not regenerating. We're not. It doesn't think about. It doesn't have the human factor in it. So we don't talk about, or they're not talking about, or thinking about, or doing the regenerating of relationships. And I think that's the key part that we need to nut out. We need to think about how to regenerate the relationships. Māori, the whenua with the tangata. So how do we get Māori thinking about moving back to the whenua, and how do we link those two things together? Because when, my dad's day, it's not 2 generations ago, they were living with, on the land, with the land, off the land. And it was the same here. This photo I'm showing here was so we own half of this land, we lease half of it. The stuff we lease is all in Māori title. So that there were villages across this valley back in the day. So yeah, the question that I always have is, how do we get back to living on the land? What changes need to be made legislatively to help that happen? And yeah, that's probably enough for me, really. Oh, 2 minutes. Okay. What else can I say? No, that's probably enough. I'm keen on the questions, really. Yeah. So tēnā koutou katoa.
Ka pai, Raihānia. Just something to add to his profile. Raihānia's a trustee on one of our land blocks up here, Mahurangi Station, and which is very much whakapapa based. So he's one of those ones they're not just doing mahi on the land down in Warapa, but also overseeing what happens on our whenua up here in Te Wairua. So kia ora. Koe rite koe, Hinekaa? Ka pai, koe rite? Ka pai, okay, kia ora.
Ai koe whiwhi te taitoko, hine rangi raua ko Seara, kia ora, roho mai, me pehe te wakauti tonu ingo. Here we go. Taua whakaaturanga, whakaatua. This is a master artwork from Robin Kahikua that was reproduced in beautiful colour images in a big book called Mana Wahine Mana Wahine, but I always in my mind say Mana Wahine Atua these days, but you couldn't maybe say that in 1990. He would say, I'll go to my notes. As I said before, everything that we see there, from my perspective, is are symbols, they're representations of our spectrum of atua that support our existence. And so we, the collective global population, humans, are hammering our ecological support systems. Everyone here is well aware of that. But these, our sources of life, as Jess mentioned in her keynote yesterday, carry also a legacy load of carbon within our atmosphere, basically from the surface of our planet, mai papatuanuku, kia rangi nui. There's a legacy load of carbon that's 2 centuries worth. And that load is not just sitting there inert, it is reacting and interacting with all the megatons that we are loading in every single day, we, the collective global human population. So that's that audio glitch. I'm really sorry. It's because Mike is also in a Zoom and should hurry him up so he can come and support you. So we know the current food production system is accelerating degrees of warming in our climate, and the current industrial agricultural production process is the largest carbon emissions profile in our country. So I do like to distinguish industrial agriculture to, you know, the whānau with a few cows or some sheep and all the different names for either organic or regenerative. I did meet a couple actually here in the Taitoko, so I don't like using that regenerative word. I don't even understand what it means. And I says, well, what are you doing? And they're like, we're just growing stuff. We're just kaupapa Māori, like trying to grow their kai, feed their whānau, share what they can, and teach their children how to do it. So I was like, okay, we'll call it kaupapa Māori, kai, mai kai. But, you know, no matter what it's called, we understand this is I guess the antithesis of the industrial agricultural model, as Mike eloquently described it earlier. And what we also know is it's extremely well resourced, probably one of the richest of the sectors in this economy. And I will name it Fonterra. There's a film out called Milked. Fonterra is the largest single contributing corporation in this country to our carbon emissions. It continues without indication of wanting to adjust from this mindset, as we've been talking, to remain profitable and internationally competitive. And that's a direct quote out of the industry released document called He Waka Eke Noa. And I love how they use our reo, use our concepts. He Waka Eke Noa is a document released in February, just a couple of months ago, which outlines the ag sector's climate change commitment to reduce net on-farm emissions. That's how it's very distinctly described. But the actual reduction in all of the number crunching is a total of 1%. So that's what their commitment is. The PM, the Prime Minister, has stated we need to transform into a sustainable food production system. And we are not seeing evidence of that transformation, whilst the window of time to change at scale is closing. So this here's a different way of visualizing information. Sorry, can I go to the next slide? How do I do that? Cool, thank you, Kiara. Some of you may be familiar with these terms. Is that a little fuzzy? Could be my visual, sorry about that. But the planetary boundaries. So a whole bunch of smart thinkers, some of them scientists, some of them not. But anyway, they've come out with all of these areas of show. Just got that message about the audio. Can you hear me? Can you hear me? Kāpai, kāhui tonu. So the ecological and biophysical limits within which our earth, our papatonu, can sustain us, the human populations. And this diagram illustrates where we've had these impacts on the boundaries. And so 3 of the boundaries have breached their safe zones. So the safe zone is the highlighted green in the center. You can see biodiversity loss smashing out there. Of course, climate crisis at the top there, it's building, and the nitrogen cycle. I'd never heard of the nitrogen cycle till I saw this graphic. And basically it's where so much nitrogen is in the environment, and we see rapid growth in nitrous oxide emissions, or the pollution of the fresh water, depletion of our ozone, things like acid rain in some countries, or big dead zones in the ocean, also loss of the drinking water, impacting human illnesses. And so all of these things are documented, and you can find these online. But the nitrogen pollution, it is impacting on the ability for all of the other boundaries, just like biodiversity loss and climate crisis are sort of entwined, and they're all just echoing around the planet. Synthetic nitrogen fertilizer, which is actually the core point that I want to make in my kōrero today, is the single largest of the breach of the nitrogen cycle. Now, I heard someone, and I was really thankful earlier today, mentioned that they appreciated the statistics. So I've got a few percentages here that might shock you. You can read those ones up there, but I want to just acknowledge here the hakapapa of this synthetic fertiliser production in our country began in 1982 when the Māori government built a factory in Kapuni in Taranaki, South Taranaki, where we are from. And mai tuakana in this hui Hinekaa Mako. So this plant in Kapuni converts the natural gas from the offshore Māori gas field, and the process which extracts inert nitrogen from the atmosphere and converts it to the form which helps plants grow, which sounds all very good. Except the rate at which the use of the fertiliser has grown so significantly, as you can see. And in terms of the climate analysis, it's a direct emission because nitrous oxide and carbon dioxide are released as soon as that fertiliser is put on the land. It doesn't even have to go through the cows. I won't read out those statistics, but I hope you all can see how this really gets to the heart of me. And about the impacts on why. So it's not only our whenua, it's our water. As we know, there's been lots of mahi, three waters reforms and things trying to look at how to protect our water. But specifically around the nitrogen balance in Aotearoa, we have worsened more than any other OECD country. And that's primarily due to the expansion and intensification of the dairy industry. At the turn of this century, so from the late 90s, just in a very short time, about a decade, the escalation, as you saw in those statistics in the last image. And so many groundwater wells in Aotearoa are exceeding the limit of the World Health Organization's nitrate contamination indicators. One thing to note too is that boiling nitrate does not reduce toxicity, it actually increases it. All of this information has been broadcast, like on Radio New Zealand. There's been some excellent stuff about also how it directly contributes to the increased bowel cancer risk to our population. And we have up to 800,000 people in our country. Every year we're getting diagnosed with 3,000 new cases. Bowel cancer is also known as colon or colorectal, also rectal cancer, and it kills 12,000 of our population every year. This is more than the breast and prostate cancer combined. It's really important that this is detected early for us to have any chance of survival, particularly our Pacific and Māori populations, where it seems that between the ages of 50 and 59, annually the data is showing 1 in 5 Māori bowel cancers are taking hold. So there's been a huge advocacy for the rate for the testing, the age of the testing for this cancer to be reduced for Māori and Pacific Islanders. Because we can't wait till we're 60 or 65 because kai mate care. And this is one of the most graphic and horrifying examples where our lands and our waters suffering that toxic poisoning is reflected, literally reflected in our illnesses that we carry in our bodies. So just to move to highlight that, I guess, how we embody our whenua, you know, he mokopuna tātai no Taranaki no te maunga, tātai whetū ki te rangi, tātai rangi ki te whenua, tātai ao, ko tātou tērā. And I just have a kōrero whakatuapeka. I learned this kupu in our Wānanga reo Taranaki. Whakatuapeka means to adapt or to paraphrase, to take what kōrero you've heard and then, you know, put your a book called the Parihaka Album in 2009, and it is a remarkable book, and it doesn't get much acknowledgement as being one of our own publishing our own stories. So acknowledging Rachel, and she wrote something that I've taken as really beautiful but really also powerful, and saying in Taranaki, our legacy is simultaneously a story of war and a story of peace, a narrative of Māori destruction and a narrative of Māori resistance and resilience. A story loved by artists and writers. It is poetic, metaphoric, and symbolic. And it is also a microcosm of the impacts felt across te ao Māori in the wake of colonial forces. I know I've only got a couple of minutes. Thank you, Kiara. So our story, as Mike indicated, our collective story it involves the Siamese twins. I call the Siamese twin industries of the oil and gas and industrial ag industries. And these twins turned up when colonization first hit us, this wave. And they are persistent reminders to our people of the land wars, the land confiscations, and the perpetual land lease system that plagues our people to this day, even as we face now the direct descendants of that first wave of colonization, with consents almost daily being awarded to these industries. For example, right now, Balance Agribusiness is taking an appeal in the High Court, I think on Monday, with our iwi, to continue to produce the urea at the Kapuni plant. And so this continued oil and gas extraction and Aotearoa and Wana and exploration of new fields still is permitted legally in our whenua. Even now, as we face the existential threats of climate crisis and biodiversity collapse, our people are dealing with increased efforts of entrenched ideologies, that mindset, digging in with the fantasy that this most extremely destructive industries can continue by simply decarbonising, by reducing the amount of carbon, often in a way that isn't even real. So are we saving the planet or are we saving the economy? This is a quote, and sorry, it's a bit crumply. I actually took the photo of the newspaper. Ariel Deranger is one of the Wahine leaders of the Indigenous Climate Action Rōpū from Kānata, the northern part of the North American continent. She writes, green capitalists across governments and businesses are repackaging our traditional ecological knowledge, Indigenous peoples' knowledge as nature-based solutions, and are selling this through carbon offset projects to enable corporate polluters and erode Indigenous land sovereignty. So when we talk about, oh, how do we change this? How do we change this? One of the hugest to just return the land, return our people to the land, that reconnection that's being mentioned. And in doing that, we will of course then enable ourselves to grow the fresh, healthy clay in the way that is good for our babies, our whenua, our land, our waters, and our holistic well-being. Recommunioning, if that's even a word, our communities. And so my thoughts, I wanted to hurry up here, I've only got a little bit left to say, but my thoughts are that we are actually we're all, as we are responsible, we're all also abdicating our duty of care right now for our whenua and our waters and our inland and coastal areas, because our responsibilities, as we know, are intergenerational. To maintain our cultural integrity, the maintenance of our kawana tikanga in our reo and in our what we do. Every day we accept and allow synthetic nitrogen fertilizers to continue to be poured on our whenua, any part of our whenua, across any of our islands, is basically going to lead to this, the perpetuation of the wars that we will have to struggle. Whānau going into the High Court, you know, we've just got to make sure that we can remove this stuff as fast as possible, and that will help exponentially, I believe, the transition toward everything that everyone's been saying. So it is vital that we actually become politically conscious, and that consciousness, like how do we pull the levers? How do we put pressure? There's heaps of examples. We've got, you know, how many years of Aotearoa fighting for us to be here. So kua roa te wā e whawhai ana, e whawhai tonu ana mātou, pera I tēnei whakāturanga, te ringatua I te ngāhuru tau. So about 10 years ago, there was this exhibition, Kāhi Kāroa, Dahi Kātoro. I think it's a bit dramatic to leave it on that, so I've got this last image. And these kōrero, which I pulled from the Y262 Aotearoa report, he kōpura tipokaya he manawa tangata, a seed tube dug up a human heart, obviously. And so we've got a return, aroha mai. Kei raru I ngā tarutaru ko ngā tuhinga o ngā tupuna, beneath the herbs and plants are the writings of our ancestors. I've got to let Mike back in this room, sorry, he's banging on the door. So
you let him bang on that door, Hinekaa. He are really good at kapoina. Hey, kia ora,